to be solving quadratics with complex numbers. Good news is we've done this before. We're just going to incorporate that imaginary number. I do have a pair. So notice how the I is going to be the coefficient of the square root, but it'll be after your coefficient that is a real number. All right, so let's start with this first one. We're going to simplify square root of negative 25. So we're first going to factor out that -1, which means we get -1 times -25, right? Because -1 times 25 is -25. Then we're going to replace that, and then we have to do that plus or minus. Then we're going to replace that -1 with my I. Bring down that plus and minus. And what is the square root of 25? 5. But remember my order. My A is 5, so we need to write it in the correct order, which means we're going to say plus or minus 5I. Isaiah, want to factor out that radical? Factor out that, factor out that -1 and then simplify. All right, so we're going to say plus or minus square root of -1 times square root of 144. We're going to replace that -1 with the I. Then the square root of 144 is 12. So we need to rewrite it in the correct order, plus or minus 12I. Questions? All right, let's go ahead and do one more where we have to simplify. Simplify the square root of 20. Okay, so let's factor out that -1 times square root of 20. But remember, we want to simplify this radical. So we're going to divide it by all of my perfect squares. So if we get 20, we divide it by 16. That's not divisible. We divide it by 9. That's not divisible. So if we divide it by 4, is it divisible? Yes, and we get 5. So these two will replace it. So we're going to rewrite plus or minus. I'm going to change that -1 to I already. Then this one is square root of 4 times square root of 5. And what is the square root of 4? 2. So we've got I times 2 times square root of 5. Now we write it in the correct order. We do plus and minus. We do our whole number first, then my I, then my radical of square root of 5. Squared, which is this one, just the x. So now we're just going to solve for x. So minus 28, we get 3x squared equals -27. We still don't have what's being squared isolated. So what do we need to do? Do we square root it yet? Right, because it has that 3, right? So what can we do? Right, how can we get rid of that 3? Yeah, divide. What are we going to divide by? Good job, Jesus. Right, we're going to divide by 3. Here. Divide by 3, and we get x squared is equal to -9. Okay, so now what do we do, Diego? There you go. Now we're going to do the square root and then plus or minus the square root. And we get x plus or equals plus or minus the square root of -9. Now we can't leave it like that. So we're going to go and do what we just did up here. So then we become, oh my goodness, plus or minus square root of -1 times square root of 9. Plus or minus my I times square root of 9 is 3. And then we put it in the right order, plus or minus 3i. And remember what that means is that we have a positive 3i and a negative 3i. Any questions? All right, so now go into your Pear Deck so you can try that problem. 16 from both sides. We get x squared equals -16. Now that the x squared is isolated, what do we have to do? Square root. So we're going to do the square root of this side and then plus or minus the square root of the other side. And we get x is equal to plus or minus the square root of -16. And then we want to factor out that -1. Plus or minus, I'm going to start writing that -1 at the end. So I'm going to say square root of 16 times the square root of -1. That way it's already in the order for us, right? All right. So what is the square root of 16? 4. So we're going to do plus and minus 4. That's what this one is. And then square root of -1 is I. So x is equal to a positive 4i and a negative 4i. Any questions? All right, go ahead and do the one on Pear Deck. The 2. How do we move that 2? Right now it's being multiplied, so what's the inverse? Right, we're going to divide it. So then we end up with x minus 4 squared equals -5. All right, so now that our squared is isolated, what do we have to do? What's the opposite of squaring? Square root. And we want to put plus and minus over here. So we've got x minus 4 equals plus and minus the square root of -5. Question so far? So from here, I'm going to change that -5 first. So we're going to say x minus 4 equals plus or minus square root of 5 times the square root of -1. Again, x minus 4 equals plus or minus square root of 5, and the square root of 1 becomes your I. I'm going to put it in the front. Because remember from our rules that I needs to go in front of my radical. Guys, remember that? Your I is in front of the radical. So because 5 is not a perfect square, it's going to go there. So from here, we're going to separate our equations, one with plus and one with minus. Actually, there's two ways we can do it. We can add 4 to this side because now we're solving for x, and add 4 to this side. And this gives us 4 plus or minus I square root of 5. Or if you're used to the other way, x minus 4 equals plus or minus I square root of 5. We can separate it into two. One with the plus and one with the minus. So we can solve where x minus 4 equals positive I square root of 5, and x minus 4 equals negative I square root of 5. And then we can add 4. X is equal to 4 plus I square root of 5. And then add 4 to this side. X equals 4 minus I square root of 5. Any questions? So you can either do them together and just make sure that you use plus and minus, or you can separate them and do the plus and the minus. All right, when you're ready, go ahead and try the one on Pear Deck. Or we can learn from our mistakes. We can't always get it right, because then there's no room to grow. All right, so here we want to identify what is being squared, and this is x minus 5. So we want to divide both by 5. You guys did a good job on this. And we got negative 4. So after this, now we can do the square root. So we end up with x minus 5 plus and minus the square root of negative 4. We've got x minus 5 equals plus or minus. We're going to factor out that negative 1. Everybody good so far? And this is where some of you guys got stumped. What is the square root of 4? 2. Square root of 4 is 2, right? And then that square root of negative 1, of course, we put an I. So now you can either break it up into 2, or you could do it both at the same time. You can add 5, and we get x is equal to 5 plus or minus 2i. Or we can say x minus 5 plus, equals plus or minus 2i is x minus 5 equal positive 2i, and then x minus 5 equals negative 2i. We add 5. X is equal to 5 plus 2i. Remember, we can combine our real numbers with our imaginary numbers. And over here, we do the same thing. X equals 5 minus 2i. Oh, I don't know what's going on with my thing. There we go. Any questions?